right into the presentations and make sure that you get the information that you want to hear, hopefully, and be able to cipher and understand exactly what is the information package for you, what they have to offer you. We have some, as Councilman Thomas says, some professionals that's been working. We made sure they've been working. And we just thank them for coming back to Bridgerton this evening from Atlanta and different parts of the state of Alabama to help us with this. And we also want to recognize Deborah Love, who's here. And everyone knows she's a contract employee with the city. We're coming down to EPA grants that we received, the Brownsville and CARE project, and she's here to make sure that we have the necessary information and that the information is factual. She does consult for the city. But with this, let me tell you a few of the rules that we're going to abide by. One thing that we're going to make sure that we're respecting, because everyone wants to hear the information. And everyone can't hear if somebody else is talking. So let's listen to the information, because we have some presenters that will present information to us. After the presentations have been done, we will ask questions. You see, there have been some maps that's been set up. They'll talk to you about those maps, and you'll have an opportunity to look at those maps. But what we don't want you to do is be disruptive. We want to be professional and respectful, as I know all citizens here can do. We will end this session at 7:30. That's why I'm going to move on, because we want you to be able to have your questions asked and answered once the presentations are done. But after 7:30, when we stop, all these presenters will have sidebar conversations with you if you have any specific questions that you would like after that time. Because everybody don't want to talk to ADM. Everybody don't want to talk to EPA. Everybody don't want to talk to the Public Health Department or Mobile County Health Department. You have specific people that you want to talk about certain things with. And we will have, and they will be around to answer those questions. So with that, we're going to have the gentleman come up from ADM. You all remember him on the last occasion, Scott Brown. And let's give him a warm welcome.
All right, folks, the last time we all got together, I talked to you all about how we're approaching this problem. There's two different things going on that are sort of working parallel. There's the air issue, which I think most everybody here is interested in the most today. And Dr. Pollard is going to talk quite a bit about that, and then Dr. Kalisko is going to talk. But there's also the water quality issue, the actual chemical in water that we're dealing with as well, sort of a parallel track. I'm up first because my presentation will be very short. I just want to bring everybody up to speed as to where we are relative to mercaptan being in groundwater. The maps that we have up front, I know you guys in the back are not going to be able to see them, but before y'all leave, please take an opportunity to come up front and look at these maps, because it'll give you a bird's eye perspective on some of the work that's been going on. But at any rate, you've got this map here, and there's the same on each side. EPA air monitoring data map and groundwater and soil boring locations. The blue area, you guys can't see it in the back right now, but come up. This is the beaver pond, the area of interest for ADM. Recall that back in January of 12, a water sample was taken at the beaver pond where it discharges, and we recorded 460 micrograms per liter. Through the course of looking into what was going on out there, we ended up finding the strain and took a sample, and you can see the value is 14,000 micrograms per liter. So what's happening is as the water comes out of the ground and travels across the pond, the mercaptan is evaporating into the air, which of course is why you folks are here tonight. While the groundwater work is going on, the borings are taking place, and again, this is ADEM working with Movo Gas and some other folks, digging around, trying to figure out how our captain got into the groundwater in the first place. So while that's going on and we're waiting for that data to come back, we had enough information at ADEM to go ahead and instruct Movo Gas to begin to work on eradicating the odor. And that's the objective, in my case, to eliminate the nuisance odor by intercepting it before it reaches the air. There are two methods that have been discussed that we could use to do just that. One would be injection of a neutralizing agent into the ground to destroy the mercaptan and thus eliminate the odor. That, in the regulatory world, which is where I work, requires a permit. You can't discharge pollutants or anything into state waters without going through a permitting process. So the whole concept of UIC is a regulatory matter as well, but the objective would be to inject an additive that would destroy the mercaptan before it's released. UIC permits are not, they're not a mystery. Folks, if you're familiar with seafood processing operations, for example, in areas in like Cutting and Grand Bay where you don't have sewer service and you're using a lot of processed water, you have basically, I'm going to call them septic tanks, that's not the correct term, but they're like a septic tank and they have fill lines, and those require UIC permits. All of that to just give you an idea that the permitting process is being discussed, and it is one option. The other option is pump and treat, basically intercepting the groundwater, pumping it through an activated carbon treatment type system, stripping the mercaptan out, and then discharging the clean water back into the pond. At this time, the final decision on which track to take has not been made, but I know that some people have mentioned concerns to me about the UIC process, which is why I went into it, Ms. Parker, for example. If it is ultimately decided that we're going to go that route, then the public will have ample opportunity to comment on that process. The pump and treat method may or may not require a permit. Don't know yet, that's a regulatory process question and we're investigating it. I guess none of that really matters at this point to you all. Just understand that while we're waiting for the actual data to come back on the groundwater work that's been done, we are still moving forward on options to intercept the mercaptan and destroy it so that it's not a nuisance to this community anymore. And that's pretty much all I had to discuss with you guys today, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. He will be back for some answering questions, but right now, if we could, we have a gentleman that is here who is, I guess you said Thompson College, and from EPA, Region 4, Dr. Solomon Hall. Yes, welcome.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Solomon Pollard. I'm the senior toxicologist for EPA in Atlanta. And I'm here tonight to talk to you a bit about the air sampling that went on back in April, at the end of April more specifically, how that's done, and what do the data mean. So I want to take a little bit of time to just kind of walk you through that entire series of steps. But I also, before I go there and we talk in detail about that, let me just kind of take a sidebar for a moment and mention that I have spoken to a few of you, and I hear you. I hear that you have public health concerns, your health, public health concerns. I want to talk to you about how this data can be used to speak to those kinds of issues, as well as the environmental world where we typically use this kind of data. So if you would go to the first slide, let's go through a little bit of that. You see, we all use the same types of data, and that's the thing that we have between us. Let me make this clear. In the center, you see the data itself, the sampling world, taking an air sample, taking a water sample, taking a fish sample, taking a sample from the environmental world. It then depends on the question that you're asking as to what happens to that data. If you're asking a question of how did this chemical get in the environment, what company's responsible for it, what processes might it be associated with. If you're asking those kinds of source-based questions, and then underneath those would be the laws that are in place that allow people to release into the air or to release into the water, those permits. Okay? That's the environmental world where there are laws in place, and you're allowed to release some quantity into the air as a company. And if you violate that and release too much, then there are consequences. So the environmental protection world, EPA, is going to look at the compliance end. Compliance is just another way of saying the law. Did you comply with the law? So we're looking at the compliance end, and therefore when we have sampling data, we then are going to look at the potential that those chemicals have for causing health effects. Underlining the word potential. We use that potential to regulate. You will see us use words like risk if the chemical has cancer potential. You'll see us use the word hazard if the chemical does not have cancer potential. And at the end of the day, we're going to talk to you in the environmental world about target organs. We can say the chemical generally affects this part of the body. On the other hand, if you're asking questions about public health, is this chemical causing an effect in the community? Is it inside of me? How much is inside of me? If you're asking those kinds of questions, those are public health questions. And therefore, we leave that to the medical side of the environmental world. The company from the federal world, the federal agency that would be the leader in answering those types of questions is abbreviated ATSDR. That stands for the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. They're a part of CDC, and they walk hand in hand with EPA quite often when there are issues and when the questions come up of what about what's inside of me or in the children, etc. So that's their world. They're typically medical doctors. They have the ability to come in and talk to you intelligently about what's in you. Here again, we're starting with the same data, what's in the environment, but they can then talk to you about what might be inside of you. They can do surveys, health surveys, where they ask you a lot of questions, or they can take tissue samples, like blood samples, hair samples, etc., and they can analyze those, or last of all, they can go and look at hospital records. You see, that's the public health piece. And that's their world, and therefore when they're talking about environmental releases, they're looking at actual public health effects. So when you talk to them, they will use words like risk, because we're all concerned with carcinogens. They will talk to you using terms like hazards for the non-cancer agents. But at the end of the day, they're going to talk to you about disease outcomes, which is really the question that's underneath of personal exposure. What might happen to me because of the personal exposure? And that's their end of the work of this environmental protection scheme. The public health questions, Okay, so that's the public health side of the data that we would collect in the environment versus the environmental compliance side, which is what EPA would provide. Lastly, before I move on into the air study, want to mention that the state of Alabama is set up similar to this, in that the state of Alabama has an environmental protection side and they have a public health side. Both of those entities are here tonight to help answer questions. So you have both federal representatives as well as state representatives. Okay, so let's move into the air study and talk a bit about that, starting with the basics. How do you take an air sample? Okay, what's the process? What's the method that you use to do that? Okay, first of all, let's go back in time. The samples were taken on the 26th, 24th through the 26th of April. The samples were collected in the early morning at around 4 to 6 a.m. In one case, the samples were collected at 3 a.m. So they were really early morning sampling. The locations were based on field instruments, meaning devices that you can use that sniff the air. Also, odors detected during sampling. So if the person doing the sampling smelled something, they went ahead and took a sample there. And last of all, odor documented locations, meaning if you called and let us know that this area smells bad, or a particular block or some area, then samples were taken in that area. So that's the sampling scheme, and here again, we call that biased because we're basing it, we're not just looking at random, we're looking where we think the odors are the worst. At least that's the thinking underneath it. The sampling itself, the equipment, it's a pump that is used to draw air into this container, the plastic container. Inside of the plastic container, you have plastic bags. That's one of them at the bottom, and here's the second one. So in this device, you have the ability to take 2 samples at one time. Okay. Typically, you're just going to use one bag. But in some cases, the process is called a split sample, where you take 2 samples at the same time, and you don't tell the laboratory where the second one came from. You just tell them to analyze it, and it should look just like the one that was taken with it. Okay? So it's a way of just checks and balances, just to make sure that our process is giving us good information. So essentially what happens is you put the top on this plastic container, and you turn on the pump. It pulls the air from inside of the container. It pulls the air out, which causes the plastic bags to expand and therefore suck air in. And therefore, what he did was he ran this. That process takes about 1 minute. So I want you to know that each one of these samples represents about a minute's worth of time. Okay. How did he take them up? From a height standpoint, at about 5 feet. The thinking is that's the breathing zone. We want our data to represent what you're exposed to. So he took them at a height of about 5 feet. Next slide. Okay, the method. The chemicals that we're looking at are not standard for us at EPA. So therefore, we had to find a laboratory that could analyze these. We did find several of them. The one that was recommended by other EPA regions and other states is located in California. So these samples went to California for analysis. Keeping in mind that we're looking at 2 sets of compounds. First, sulfur compounds. There's about 12 to 15 of those specific chemicals that fall under that category of sulfur compounds. And then we were looking at methane. Here again, 3 days worth of sampling from the 24th through the 26th. The sampling continued until each one of those bags, those plastic bags, that's the formal name for them, Tedlar, each one of those bags was 2/3 filled with air. Of course, you didn't want to overfill them and burst the bags or anything like that. So therefore, 2/3 filled, and then the bags were shipped off for analysis. Okay, where were the samples taken? Okay, this map you really can't see very well. It was a background sample way away from the primary sample area in 8 Mile. Okay, so the samples were located in this area. But here again, there was a background sample. We have posters over on the side that give you a better understanding of each one of those sample locations. But for the meantime, let's go through and talk about each one of the sample locations. If you will. Okay, the first sample is the background sample. The background sample is located, or was located, at Shelton Beach Road and Industrial Parkway. The next sample was at Indian Springs Elementary. You notice that each sample is called EM and then a number. EM stands for 8 Mile, and then the number, an arbitrary number was given to each one. So the second sample was at Indian Springs Elementary School. The third sample was at Gulf South Front Gate, intersection of Suncrest and Lott Road. The next one was at the intersection of Brunswick Drive and East Ridge. Sample number 5 was at Bear Fork Road, 240 feet west of Stedham Drive. The sixth sample was located at Shelton Beach Road, 350 feet east of West Myers Road. The seventh sample was at the Cemetery Gate. The eighth sample was at the intersection of Ivaloy Drive and Shelton Beach Road. The 9th and 10th sample is that split sample that we were talking about. 9 and 10 was located at Ivaloy Drive and Cochran Road. Here again, split sample. The next sample was also split, so that's 11 and 12. That was taken at Beaver Pond on the north side. And the last sample, which was split once again, that's 13 and 14. That was taken at Beaver Pond at the spring. Next slide. All right, now let's talk about what the data mean. Before we can do that, let me give you an understanding of how we analyze data in this way. It's called screening, the process is. And here's how it basically goes. We look through the literature. Typically that means look at EPA's website. We have lots of scientific labs that do tests on chemicals. And the results of those tests are put into a database on the internet. So you can simply log into the internet and it gives you numbers that describe how toxic a chemical is and whether or not it is a cancer agent, or whether or not it has developmental effects on children. All that kind of information is available at the EPA website, but not in this case. Here again, these chemicals are outside of our typical. There are 188 chemicals that we focus on in the air world, air toxics, 188. These chemicals fall outside of that. So our typical approach didn't really work, and therefore that's part of the reason why, one of the reasons why it took a while to get this done was we had to find comparison numbers, something to compare it with, because EPA didn't have numbers. Therefore, that translates into searching databases, not only from the United States, but in other countries. Canada is always one of my favorites. They have good sets of data. We looked at databases in France. We even looked at a couple of Japanese databases. That was difficult, but I'll just leave that alone. Bottom line is we looked at a lot of different databases to find numbers or concentrations, health benchmarks that we could use to make comparisons to the concentrations that we detected. Okay. That took months getting to just a few numbers here, and you'll see from this table there weren't that many chemicals that were detected. Now let's focus first of all on the sulfur compounds. What you're going to see here with the sulfur compounds, there are 3 of them, right there, 3. What I'm showing you first is the sample maximum concentration. In other words, out of every sample that we took, what's the highest concentration for the first chemical, which is tertiary butyl mercaptan? What's the highest concentration? And that's what we are doing in our analysis. We want to start by looking at the maximum and comparing that to our health benchmark, the concentration of the health benchmark. Okay, so the highest concentration that we detected was 230 parts per billion, and that was found at EM13. And EM13 happens to be the location where the spring is located. Okay, so that's 213, and the health benchmark that we used was 500. That came from that exhaustive survey of international databases to find what's a good number to compare to. Well, 500 turns out to be that number, 500 parts per billion, and that's about the only number that's out there. That's unusual for me to say that. Usually I have all kinds of concentrations and health benchmarks to talk to you about. Some for short-term exposure, some for 1 to 14 days, some for a lifetime. I have all kinds of benchmark concentrations that I can talk to you about. In this case, I have that one. So I'm at a disadvantage in what's that I'm outside of the typical. We will note, however, that tertiary butyl mercaptan, which is the primary chemical of interest, was identified in 9 out of 34 samples. At the spring, where the 230 was identified, that happens to be a little more than 2 times less than a comparison level. Needless to say, if you compare the maximum concentration to the health benchmark and it's not above the health benchmark, then you know that all the concentrations that are less than the maximum would fall under that health benchmark. The second chemical that was detected, that's a sulfur compound, is ethyl methyl sulfide. The highest concentration for it was 72 parts per billion. It was detected in 6 out of the 34 samples. There's a problem. There were no health benchmarks that I could identify for that one, so I don't have a comparison point for you. I will just make sure that it's clear that we did detect that. We did find that in the number of samples. And the last sulfur compound is diethyl sulfide. The highest concentration was 33 parts per billion. It was in the area of the pond. I might be, is at the area of the, oh, that's the split sample, I'm sorry. So it too was in the area of the spring. 13 and 14 are both from the spring. It's a split sample. So it was in one of the samples only, out of the 34 that is. The concentration that we're comparing it to, health benchmark-wise, is 500 parts per billion, and it turns out that 33 is about 15 times lower than the 500. So that chemical also falls below the screening level. Methane was the second class of chemicals that we were looking for, or is the second chemical itself that we're looking for. Methane levels are reported in percent concentration in ambient air. What we found was methane was found in every one of the sampling locations on every day. So 34 out of 34 samples, we did identify methane. The highest concentration was in EM2, which was, I remember, Indian Springs, thank you, at the Indian Springs location. But if you would, and here again, that's 0.042% of the air. Essentially, that's saying that it's a small fraction of the air, if you will. The range that was detected was from 0.02 to 0.42%. The average of all those is 23, so it's right in the middle between 2 and the 42, if you would. Allow me to bypass the zeros. It's right in the middle between those, and the standard deviation, the variation, in other words, around 23 is about 0.4. So the numbers were really very close to each other. So what does that mean? What that means is that methane is kind of at the same level throughout the community, which is a good thing, because methane, one of the reasons for looking for that would be to try to document whether or not there's a natural gas leak. And therefore, this study suggests that there is no natural gas or no area where we're seeing concentrated methane in the air. Now, at the bottom, I want to just kind of mention that we have a legend at the bottom that talks to you about where the screening level came from. First, for the tertiary butyl mercaptan of 500 parts per billion, what sources or references, if you will, provided that number or agreed with that number. There were petroleum companies. The country of France has and these are all worker-based numbers or worker-based health benchmarks. France, Finland, and if you convert and look at surrogate chemicals, what does that mean? That means chemicals that are chemically similar to the one that's of interest. And if they're similar, they should have the same health effects. There were a number of studies that supported that N-butyl-mercaptan and butyl-mercaptan are both surrogates for tertiary butyl-mercaptan. Okay? So therefore, looking at the health benchmarks that would be associated with those other chemicals, we had NIOSH, which is a part of CDC, the Chemical Society World at a time had another worker number, and OSHA, which is CDC again. I'm sorry, not CDC. OSHA is its own agency, excuse me. Okay, so we had other worker-based concentrations that agreed with the 500. All of these sources agreed with the 500. We're presenting those to you because we're outside of the typical. Typically, I would just put one source there, and it would be EPA. And that's easy for you to verify and corroborate. Now, with the other chemical where we had a number, a health benchmark, diethyl sulfide, that 500 parts per billion. Well, where does that come from? Diethyl sulfide screening level is from dimethyl disulfide. And that chemical is suggested by the literature is a surrogate for diethyl sulfide. So therefore we went with that concentration or that health benchmark of 500. And here again, otherwise there was nothing available under diethyl sulfide itself. Next slide. Okay, so what does all this mean? Let's give a few summary thoughts here before we stop and let's take questions. First of all, sulfur chemicals were detected. The concentrations were less than the worker exposure screening levels. And not all the compounds that we detected could be screened. One of them we did not have a screening level that we could apply. Second, tertiary butyl-mercaptan is unusual in that it can be detected by inhalation at 0.1 all the way up to 1 part per billion. What does that mean? That means that you smell this easily. A small amount could be in the air and you detect it with your nose very quickly. Just so you'll have that understanding, that's called a odor threshold. So the odor threshold for this chemical is lower than most chemicals. You detect it very easily and it's very annoying. Methane was detected at concentrations that were fairly uniform throughout the sampling area, including the background area. Screening concentrations were not available for methane. We can develop something to screen it if we convert all the numbers into concentrations. We're not finding that those numbers that we found in the sampling were high at all. So therefore, we didn't take that next step, which would be to convert those. And the last slide. The study, the sampling study. We've heard that there's interest in getting a copy of it. The study looks like this. Okay, it's a printed document. I'm leaving 3 copies here in the library for you to access, and I'm making this available at that website. It's not on there right now. I've made the request, it's been approved, so any day now it's going to end up on that website. If you go to that website, what you'll see is a list of documents, typically from other communities. So yours would be there in that place. It has the name 8 Mile Pritchett Air Study. So you'll see it on that website within the next few days. Otherwise, you can speak to the mayor or any of his staff to find out where the repository is for the 3 copies that I'm leaving. For those of you who just like to go and take a quick look at it rather than printing this out. Now, what's in the document? The reason for the sampling, the locations, maps of the locations, more maps than the one that I showed. There are 3 of them I think in there. They give you good information as to exactly where the samples were taken. Also, the sampling results, there's really only 3 pages for 3 days of sampling, and it identifies every chemical that was detected and when where it was detected, which days, etc. All that's in those 3 tables, and it's pretty user-friendly. You'll be surprised. It's easy to understand what was detected, when, and where. And last of all, it gives you the information, a volume of information that is necessary in the environmental world. Whenever samples are taken, there's chain of custody. We rely on the sample. We need that data to be absolutely as accurate as possible. And therefore, we put a lot of pressure on laboratories and the people who take the samples to document everything. And therefore, what you'll see in this document is all that information, the paper trail. It's government. Paper is normal for government. So there's lots of paper in there that gives you not only the information on when the sample was taken and sent off, but also when it went through the machine that told us what was in the sample. It gives you those printouts, each page from that. All that's in the document for your interest. Last of all, I want to introduce the state of Alabama's medical toxicologist. His name is John Garisco, I think. He's here in the front. Public health questions. As you move into that world of asking, okay, now you told me what's in the air, now talk to me about what's inside or what are the potential health effects. Well, John is here to help us work through that and try to give you whatever answers we can find or whatever was available in the literature. Here again, his database is difficult too because there's not a lot in there about the health effects of this chemical. This group of chemicals is outside of our typical, but that doesn't mean we have nothing. Okay? We will give you what we know. So with that, I'll kind of stop at this point and
Okay, he said you don't have a presentation, but he'd be glad to answer any questions. So if you would, what we would like for you all to do, the 3 copies that we received, you would be able to find copies at both libraries and at City Hall, Avon and Richard. And those are the 3 copies that we have for you to review if you do not have a computer where you can go and download this information. Okay? So with that, if anyone has any questions, we would ask that you utilize the 2 microphones here. Come up, give your name, your address, ask your question, and hopefully we will get your questions answered by one of these gentlemen and representatives that have been forward. Please, we don't want to spend a whole lot of time on talking about what your problem is. Just ask the question that you need to be asking, and we move forward. If you would, come on up.
That's a good question. How those other sulfur compounds are associated, whether they're derivatives, chemicals do interact when they're put together, whether it's derivatives or whether it's impurities in the process or whether or not the mercaptan interacted with something in the environment to give you a secondary pollutant. We're really not sure. I didn't really take this to the modelers, people who look at chemicals. When you release one, you put it in the environment, and what happens to it, how it might be changed, transformed. I didn't really go to the modelers to ask that type of question. So whether this is a before versus an after effect, I didn't get that from this study. The modelers would need more information. Keep in mind, we wanted to do a quick study to get you information you want to know now. We didn't want to do it exhaustive. We can be long-winded. Okay? So therefore, we didn't want to go into extreme detail. So that question would be a question that we don't necessarily have an answer for, but it is a good question.
Yes, sir. You said the samples that you all took was between 3 and 6 and 4 and 6. why was that time, who made that decision to take those samples at that time? The reason being is the McCaffrey usually starts sometime between 5:30 as its strongest point, between 5:30 and 8 o'clock at night. 3 o'clock in the evening time. Okay, 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning is dissipating then. So my question is, who made that decision to take those samples at that time?
I wasn't involved in that process. I can give you what I've heard when you're getting the decisions made. For the most part, it was based on community.
My name is William McBride, and I've been working with the community with the care grant that you all had and identifying with the health risk order. When we chose to take the sample at that time, we were getting feedback from the community. And based on that feedback, we felt that we were smelling the chemical more in the morning. Now, if you go and look at the document that Solomon is making available, it will explain to you why the sample, why we selected that time in more detail. And it will also tell you that during that time, the weather pattern shifted. That was in the spring. And as you all are aware, sometime in the spring you have what you call an Easter snap. It got cold during those days. And this chemical will smell better when it's hot. So we agree and we understand that we were just giving you the best information and doing the best we could at that time. We didn't have control over the temperature and the light.
So hard about going to the microphones.
And my answers to that, hold on, I'll answer one question at a time. I'll get you. Okay.
Is this, I got it.
Her question was, did we also account for the meteorological impacts for taking the sample? Basically, sometimes the wind blows stronger at times, sometimes the wind does not blow stronger. If you look at the document that Solomon is telling you will have access to, it does tell you the weather patterns at that time. So we did take those things into account. Those are things that we cannot control. And it tells you that in the document.
I understand that part, that we can't control the weather, but if the weather is not conducive to sampling, doing air sampling, then wouldn't it be more logical to do it at a different time as opposed to 4 to 6 in the morning, push it maybe toward the afternoon or late evening as when the smell is really, you know.
I understand. And the best answer I can give you to that is we were asked to come out and respond to the issue that you had. And based on that, what we were hearing from the mayor, from the community as well, is that we needed to come out and see what was going on. So we came out and did the best we could at that time in order to come back here today to give you some type of answer. Keep in mind, we had to travel from Atlanta to get that information. So we couldn't just come and say we're gonna stay here until the best time to take those samples. We had to come in.
I understand that again, but again, 4 to 6 in the morning is not the most conducive time to do air sampling to me, because the air is pretty much still. Right, it's pretty much still at that time. And you have to take that in consideration as well as, you know, the sampling of the actual air. I mean,
Well, let me answer that, because that question was asked, and we talked about that. And I made a statement when I had a meeting earlier with them, and I told them that I would be asking the council to appropriate funding for us to do an independent study for the city of Pritchard with that. And that will be coming in the near future for us to do that, because we, and like you say, they come from Atlanta, that we are going to, I will be asking the council to appropriate funding for the city to do an independent study outside of these agencies that have done this. Because it's not that we're saying that their reports was wrong, but we thought that that was a lot stronger than it was reported. And at that point, there were some cold weather that was coming through during that time that may have interrupted some of those samples. And I had a conversation with Ms. Love, and grab sampling is different than having sampling to where they can actually sit out there for some period of time to collect this campaign. So we're going to do an independent air sampling through the city.
Williams and May. And the question is, y'all need air sample. And I know it's in there, but where is it coming from? Undoubtedly it's coming from the ground. But y'all didn't know this research.
Okay, so the question is, did we just focus on air sampling, or have we also collected samples from the ground, right? Looking at these charts, you can see, again, I'm sorry it's not up on the big screen, but after this is over, come down and look, because you guys will be able to see some of the work that's been going on in terms of groundwater sampling. The borings that are taking place here, this is the Gulf South facility. Here's the pond, right? This is the, for all practical purposes of this meeting, this is the source of the mercaptan, and this is the point where it reaches the air and then travels out throughout the community. So the answer is yes, there have been quite a few borings done and samples collected, and they are not available yet. It's that data that we're going to be using to help determine the spatial extent of the mercaptan in the groundwater. Now, having said that, do not forget also that we have collected samples of water from the pond itself, where it discharges, right at Cochran Road, and the spring. So there has been water samples collected, surface water samples, and groundwater samples. The groundwater data is just not available. But we reiterate, the department is not holding up on moving forward with how to eradicate the odor, waiting on the samples. The samples are going to help us determine the spatial extent of the contamination. So we're still moving forward while that data is being generated and reviewed with the corrective actions.
My name is Wanda Henderson, and I live at 4216 Glenwood Drive in 8 Mile, Alabama. And my question is, I heard that you were thinking about putting an injection into the water, or you were thinking about filtrating the water. But I have not heard anybody say where exactly the mercaptan is coming from and how you're going to stop it. I mean, you're talking about clearing the water, but you're not talking about just absolutely ending the leak.
Okay, our best information right now is there is no continuous leak. We believe that there was a one-time event that occurred sometime in the past at or near the Gulf South facility, right? We believe there was a leak at one time that occurred here. We believe that the groundwater has transported the mercaptan down to these springs, which feed this beaver pond. And as the mercaptan travels across the beaver pond, once it's come out of the ground, right, now it's being exposed to the atmosphere, to the sun, the mercaptan is volatilizing, and then it floats across the community. To our knowledge, the best information we have right now is that there is absolutely no continuous leak. One-time event, groundwater is contaminated, we know that. We're working on eradicating the source of the odor. We've checked pipelines. I have personally walked all the pipelines you can see on these maps. I've walked every one. I've walked all through the woods. And you guys, I mean, to understand where we are now from where we were back in January, it's a lot of things that have gone in to get to this point right here. I realize we haven't eliminated the odor, right? I've got that. But a lot of work has been done just to get to this point. We started out knowing nothing except the citizens in the community were reporting a natural gas leak.
Explain to me this afternoon after the rain. It got so bad. White water in the house.
Okay. What do you mean it got bad? The smell got stronger. More concentrated.
After the rain.
Okay. That could be attributed to the discharge rate from the spring, right? The rain feeds the groundwater, pushes more water out. It could be atmospheric conditions. I don't know how the stuff interacts in the atmosphere. We have heard that the smell or the odor is stronger in the evening time and in the early morning time, not as strong during the daytime. That in itself makes sense because the sun is boiling stuff off and it's probably going up over the community as opposed to laying across the land. I don't know the exact answer, but I would say probably related to the climate, how heavy the air is with the water, and how high the mercaptan can get into the air, or how low it is held to the ground.
Scott Croy, Pritchard City Council. I thank you and ADM for what you're trying to do to identify the areas where the concentration is likely at its highest. But I think for clarification, you mentioned about the areas of the groundwater source have been tested, or at least some prospective areas have been at least tested. The results have not come back. Is that clear?
That's clear. I do not have the data back yet.
Okay. How long has it been since the initial testing?
I don't know the answer. That is handled by my geologist colleagues in Montgomery. I was not personally involved. So.
There's a July 27th deadline, and that report is supposed to be submitted to ADM with that groundwater and soil data. So we are supposed to have that report by July the 27th.
Okay, how long has it been since you initiated the testing?
There was a cleanup agreement that was signed between ADM and Mobile Gas. I'm shocked you laid down. There was a cleanup agreement or an assessment agreement that was signed between ADM and Mobile Gas. I believe that agreement gave them, it was either 90 or 180 days to collect that data and submit that data to the department. But I do know the deadline is July the 27th. We have been informed by Mobile Gas that they have every intention of meeting that deadline. So by July the 27th, we are looking to have that report in our hands at ADM that gives us the groundwater and soil analytical data for the site up there.
Thank you. So Scott, I want also to clarify too that there has been no testing of the groundwater per ADM staff or personnel. This is Mobile's Mobile Gas's attempt to determine the groundwater source. Is that clear? Because I think there may be some confusion as to whether ADEM is doing its own independent review in addition to making sure that Mobile Gas follows through with you guys' mandate.
It's a cooperative effort.
Okay, I think that explains it. Okay, thank you.
Just to clarify that one thing, we had one of our own geologists on site when the vast majority of that data was collected. They were there when the drilling rig was on site doing the drilling. They were there when the soil samples were taken out of the ground. They were there to do some field observations as far as smelling the water and the soil and so forth. So our geologists have been on site and down here and heavily involved with the oversight of the collection of that data.
Excuse me, sir. Give us your name, please.
I'm sorry, I'm Scott Hughes. I'm with ADEM.
Good evening. Andre Reed on Horse Park Drive. Gentleman from Atlanta, I know in your data you're saying so far you're going to determine what you have is not harming anyone, I guess. My question is this. If you've been smelling this amount since 1997, would it kill it? Would it give us cancer? Would it do anything? Can anyone answer that?
Not with the data that's available. Typically, yes, I could talk to you about what potential health effects that we would predict based on what's in the literature or what's in the databases. But to answer your question, we don't have the information that would allow me to address that. Would you want to?
The limited data that is available indicates that there is these compounds have never been tested for carcinogenicity, which means that they have never been tested to determine if they will cause cancer. However, they have been tested to determine if there's any kind of reproductive toxicity or genotoxicity. There is none for either one of those. It's all animal testing. And it's unethical to test in humans, so it's hard to get that except outside of that. So, the long term, there is unknown. It is limited data. There is very, very limited data.
I mean, I'm not on fire. We don't have data. And I can tell you that you can see all of them. And then on one side, and I point to think what they gas that we're not supposed to give you, they don't know that. Or you don't know that. Because we don't have that sample. So why can't we walk around with cancer or something and everybody say they're not caused by this, and they could be caused by this? Because you don't have any data to prove it either right or wrong. That's all I'm saying.
When there are no studies, there's no data. And we're trying to find it. This has not happened before. I just want y'all to know, we're trying to find the answers for it. This hasn't happened before. I can't say you're the study. I can say, but you know, I didn't do it, but I'm trying to help you. Trying to help. I know, and I've smelled it and I have inspected it, and it's horrible. I agree. I don't know how you've done it. But I just want y'all to know, we've tried very, very hard. This hasn't happened before, and we're trying to find the answers, and yes, sir, in the green shirt.
My name is David Underhill. I live in Mobile, where I'm a member of the Sierra Club. I have two questions about this issue of exposure level that's just being discussed. You did give some data. You said 500 parts per billion was the number you had arrived at for the benchmark, which if I understood right, means below which there is deem no risk and above which harm begins to occur according to this very skimpy data available. If the data is so skimpy, and judging from what both of you have just said, it's beyond skimpy, then does that number mean anything about the hazards involved at that level? And secondly, second question, even for substances where there is abundant information, hasn't it often proved true that historically levels of exposure that were thought to be safe were later discovered not to be safe?
Okay, both of those points were well taken. Let's start with the first one, which had to do with, your first question you were asking whether or not that 500 means anything, correct? Okay. The 500 is a worker protection number. So yes, if we were talking about a worker scenario, that is directly relevant. So yes, it would have meaning in that environment. We're using it outside of that because that's all we have. And that's why I made it up as clear as I could that, yeah, there's stipulations about that number. There's some softness about it. It's not the typical type of toxicity number that I use or I'm accustomed to using at EPA to talk to you about potential effects. So yes, it does have some shortcomings, but it is useful. Compared to saying that there is no number and not providing anything, a number is better than zero, than no number at all. So to a large degree, yes, there is some usefulness in it. I'll come back to you. All right, and the second question had to do with, excuse me, what was it again? I'm sorry. I think you had, okay, yeah. Yes, okay. And the opposite goes true. That swings in both directions because you know the basis for what we know about chemicals is usually animal studies. We have enough research in place to be able to make predictions about human exposure based on animal data. Sometimes that data goes awry and we find that humans don't behave at all exposure-wise like we had predicted. And it could go either way. Less could cause harm, or they could tolerate a lot more. So that pendulum kind of swings in both directions. But you're right, that is a point in toxicology that yes, we are making the best guess we can, unless there is human data. Usually when we get human data, it's by mistake. And a worker was exposed by mistake. So we know that it causes an effect on the kidneys or whatever. So in those cases, yes, we know. But when we're extrapolating from animal studies, keeping in mind that when we do this, when we venture into deciding what's a good safe number to hang our hats on and protect people, we're going to put some safe limits, some conservative uncertainty factors in there. What does that mean? Instead of, if we think from the animal studies that a good safe limit for a human would be 10, we'll drop it down by a factor of 10 to 1, or by a factor of 1,000 to 0.01. That's our way of being protective. So we never just go with what we get from the animal studies. We put in factors to account for the fact that it was not a human study. And that if anything, we're trying to err on the side of being overly protective.
Okay, hi, my name is Keisha, and I live on Shelton Beach Road. This afternoon, it rained, and when I went outside, I was sick to my stomach, and then I had a migraine. I had to go back inside and take some medicine and lay down. That's how powerful it is. And that's what I want to address to you guys.
If you have a question, if you would stand, please. Wait. Mayor has one, then this lady, and there's someone over here. Okay. Second.
Yes, my name is Nathaniel Davis. I live on the corner of Brunswick and Forest Park Drive. Out of all the information you've given out, I haven't heard anyone say anything about who makes this chemical. Have anyone contacted them to find out what does this chemical do? Now, I've dealt with chemicals, I've hauled chemicals, I've done a lot of things with chemicals in the trucking industry. Now, every chemical company I've ever been into, I've been to some of the most deadliest chemical companies in Mobile, Alabama. That's Tegucigalpa. One of the most convenient ones here that knows about Tegucigalpa knows. Hey, matter of fact, one of our neighbors years ago, the place is so dangerous, fell into a bath. Made a mistake and fell in? Okay, all they did was fish bones out of that bath. That's how deadly those chemicals are. Now, has anybody contacted the chemical company that makes this stuff? Because they've got rules and regulations on how to handle it. Because all that employees know, hey, it's dangerous, put on a gas mask. If it's hazardous to touch, put on a rubber suit. Completely. So, someone, I can give me information, I'll contact them to find out what does this chemical do to us. Because they know. They may not want to give it to you. They can tell you exactly what this chemical will do to you, what it won't do to you. So, I think someone needs to contact them. Like I said, give me the information, I'll contact them. I'll talk with them, find out what do we need to do. We're down here. The man that makes this stuff, he's up here. And we need to move here, up here with him, and find out what he knows, so we'll know exactly what he knows. Thank you.
Okay, with regard to the chemical manufacturer, there's three, let me just say 3 to 5. I think it was 3 chemical companies that produce that chemical. I did look at all of their websites. One of them I quoted in the 500 number that I used. It's at the bottom. It was Chevron. No, you're right that chemical manufacturers do typically test their chemicals. In the regulatory world, though, they don't necessarily report the results of those tests. They don't publish them. Publishing means you put the results of your test in a scientific magazine called a journal. When you put it in there, there are reviewers, other scientists who will look at what you did and determine whether or not it was credible. And if so, it gets accepted into that magazine, and then it's considered a foundation document that we can all use in whatever purposes. The chemical manufacturer companies don't report, they don't publish. And they may or may not make the data available. They may give you some wording that says, we tested it, we didn't see anything with regard to this issue. But they don't necessarily give you the exact understanding of what all they found. And until it's published in a magazine, I'm calling it a magazine, the correct term should be journal. Until it's published in a journal, it is not considered defensible. So therefore, yes, we could perhaps approach them further to try to get information from them. But if it's unpublished, it's hard to stand in front of you and talk to you about data that's unpublished from a science standpoint. I hope that's a helpful answer. But the ultimate answer is I did check their websites to see what kinds of information is available. I kind of exhausted the internet trying to find anything that was available on this. So yes, that effort was there. They just didn't give me anything on those websites, other than where this kind of protection, if you're working in the chemical industry, protective kinds of clothing, to give you that information. But really, the underlying studies and whether or not it's been published and what were the concentrations they used and what was it an animal study, rats, rabbits, mice, you don't get that from them unless it's published.
Excuse me, we are missing a microphone. Now I know 1 and 2. Where's number 3? Hand it back. Case solved.
Excuse me, my name is William Yates. I live in Forest Park Drive, and what you said, Mr. Powell, is true as reference to chemical operator. You do have to have range, you do have to have structure. I was an operator at one time. But in the guidelines, anytime you offload or unload chemical, that is in that operating book that tells you what hazardous it is and the reason why you have to have it there. I do what you're saying is that there's a leak though, the man right there requesting this as a leak, but you got to have a spill with that this type of capital that's being inundated in the air. I mean, you got to have more than just some water running through. A leak is a leak. Now, we all know if you have a leak on the water line, it'll dry up. But a spill will not dry up. So we use the term leak as opposed to a spill. I think that's misdirecting people from my personal standpoint. And we need this, how you say, call it what it is, and not it's just a leak. And also, I'm just an operator, that's all I can tell you. But only I can tell you, when you say that you use basically mice to determine the ratio as to what it would do to a human and what it would do to a rat, or mice, but see, I was exposed to a chemical and they got some data in Chicago to determine what the ratio was to the human and what it was to the rat. It wasn't, you say you're going to extrapolate, I understand that, but
Well, we have a question over here.
Okay, I have two questions. My name is Julia Lucy, and I live at Eckhoff Drive in 8 Mile. And my first question is, will there be another air test performed? And if so, in order to get a more comprehensive sample, would it not be more logical to do the study throughout the entire evening and into the morning to account for the entire period in which the odor is at its worst?
Okay. All right. Whether or not there's going to be another sampling effort, your mayor was just mentioning that he's talking about getting the appropriations so that you can perform your own sampling work. So yes, that potentially is in the works. With regard to sampling more rigorously, longer terms during the day, is that where this? Okay. That would be ideal. There are issues with the sampling world, okay? What you typically would love to do is run air through some device that captures the chemicals that are in the air and accumulates them over the course of one whole day, 24 hours. That's ideally how it should be done. That's what we'd love to have here. We just don't have that kind of science in place right now for this chemical set. So therefore the best that could be done was to go out and do what did I think, 1 to 3 minutes to fill that bag. That's a snapshot. That's not typically what we do at all at the agency, but we have to kind of comply with what the science allows us to do. Maybe there's some possibilities where there are individuals who will be chasing down whether or not there's some alternative sampling approaches that we can apply here. And therefore that information will be fed to your mayor and his group so that the next sampling effort takes it a next step further.
My question is twofold. I'm from Woodlow Drive. This comes right behind my house and I smell that stuff. It smells awful. But I have a quick twofold question. Do you have any MSD on fracking, and has fracking taken place in this area? And those of you who are not familiar with the MSD, if we have the MSD, that will give us all the information on everything that has taken place, because that's your material safety data, which must go along with chemicals.
Go ahead, bro.
Thank you.
Well, to my knowledge, fracking has to do with a different industry, but I don't know anything about fracking. Wait, whose turn is it? Wait a minute, this gentleman here? Okay, he's been standing a long time.
My name's Shane Rayford. I live in Sims, Alabama. I'm a 20-year retired Coast Guard veteran. I did 20 years of hazmat response with the EPA. I did a lot of these same courses, groundwater investigation, whatnot. My question is, whenever you're going to do possible chemical injection, no one has told the public what they plan to inject that well with. Are we going to poison poison? That's what I'm asking. Are we going to have another Deepwater Horizon corrects it? So these are just some of the questions. With the groundwater being contaminated that far down, the leak you've already said is not active. I agree. Pipeline's clear. But is the material around it, the soil contaminated? Are you going to excavate it? Or at every rain, is it still going through the soil and contaminating the groundwater?
All right, let me go with valid points, right? That's why I brought it up originally. There are two additives that I've heard of that are potential injection compounds. Ozone and chlorinated type compound. I do want to emphasize here, no decision has been made on what process will be followed. I wanted everybody here to know, while we're working on dealing with groundwater contamination, so far, there are two options that have been discussed. The UIC, and one is public tree, groundwater filtering contaminated water. No decision has been made yet on which way to go, but as far as UIC goes, because that does require a permitting process, there will be ample opportunity for the public to comment before any permit is issued, if that is the route that is chosen. As far as the pump and treat, regulatorily, I do not know at this point whether or not that might require a permit or not. And if it doesn't require a permit, then it's just going to happen and take place. Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer right now. Yeah, and it's pointed out to me, of course, that the soil around the contaminated area was removed back when the leak was discovered. So there has been excavation that has taken place. At the source of the spill, that was one of the first things that took place, was excavating the soil to get the contaminated soil out of contact with the groundwater and then backfill to the material. So what we're left with right now, as far as we know, is clean hole with happening in groundwater that's now migrating from basically this area down here. Where are we in the process? I don't know. That's what all of these sampling points are ultimately going to tell us. All we know at this point could be the tail end of this, maybe not. There's a lot of work that's still taking place.
My question is, where exactly is Bear Pond? I've been in the area for a while. I don't know exactly where it is. Beaver Pond.
Okay, if you're familiar with Ivaloy, you know where Ivaloy is, you know where Cochrane Road is.
But this is what I'm saying. How close is it from the cemetery? Because even though it's in the area, the cemetery is like the hardest smelling spot that little being that you get to. And it has everybody that maybe that's underground
if you come up here and look at the map, you got the pond is right here, and the cemetery entrance is right here.
Do you think there may be a correlation between that and the cemetery being here 15 years ago, this underground?
I'm sorry, I missed part of that question. Do I believe?
Does the cemetery have anything to do with the groundwater? With the smell? No.
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. There's no evidence whatsoever that the captain has anything to do with the cemetery.
My name is Joe Simmons. I live on 5008 Hattie Lane in 8 Mile, Alabama, about 2 blocks from here. To piggyback off what the gentleman here said about the MSDS sheets, which is your manufacturer data safety sheets, y'all blew that man off. Nobody never get a response to the question they asked. Is there an MSDS sheet available around somewhere telling us about the use and the dangers of the mercaptan? Because anytime you use a chemical anywhere, I don't care what job site, I don't care what company you work for, there's the MSDS sheet available on site for personnel to use just in case, something happens. And just in case, we had, this is a little BB spill we had right here on dry land, but they call it a mercaptan spill. Okay? Nothing's been rectified. Nothing's being done. My question to you is, who or what agency authorizes or issues permits for these companies to use these chemicals, to use these substances, and without even having knowledge of the effect that it's going to have in the community on the people living around?
Okay, going back to your first point, which involved the gentleman in the MSDS sheet, I think Dr. Pollard had already addressed that. In his report, he references the Chevron Phillips MSDS sheet as being one of the sources he cited for the 500 parts per billion number. Yes.
With those mercaptan MSDS sheets, let's just say this. Whenever a chemical company talks about a chemical that they make, those chemicals typically have impurities or side chemicals in there with them. So the laundry list is a little different for each one. They may or may not point to one chemical and say, here's what we know about this one. They may give you some generalities about the chemical grouping in terms of health effects or whatever information they provide. But it's their recipe for that particular chemical. When they make it, certain other chemicals are impurities that they don't necessarily feel are issues. Arkema is another chemical company that had really nice information about it. It was one of the others that kind of referenced the 500, but I really wanted to go to the sources of the 500. So if an MSDS says 500 from this place, then I went to this place to see where they developed the 500 from. So even the only way that I would reference Chevron is because they said here's 500 and we feel that 500 is appropriate. That's how they were brought into this. So yes, you're right, MSDS sheets are very valuable. They have lots of great information in there, but they are all a little bit complicated in trying to sift through what exactly are they saying. Is it exactly applicable to what we're doing and to what we're looking at? It's a call. And yes, but there are MSDS sheets, you're absolutely right. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, the second part of your question, with who regulates, what government agency regulates pipelines? The if I'm not mistaken, that's the Pipeline Transmission Safety Board. And I just want to point out that if the captain has an odorizer for natural gas, it's used certainly throughout the United States, and it's been used for a century, 3/4 century, I don't know. But it's the reason I believe it was selected is because, as Dr. Pollard pointed out, the odor threshold in the human body ability to detect it is so low, and there is no available data, no data to indicate that it is any great hazard to the community. Right? That's why it's injected in the first place, or used in the first place as an odor. In this case, what we're dealing with here is a concentration that's just not normal. If this were a typical gas leak and we go and get it fixed, we don't even think of it at the same time. That's the whole point of this. I believe everybody here is concerned because we're not just dealing with it. And so, yeah, it's an unusual circumstance. Basically, we have taken this stuff and leaked it in the ground, and now we're dealing with what we're dealing with.
All right, we have one question here, and I will have a final question, and then we would allow you all to have questions if you have some personal things that you would like to talk to them about on the side.
Yes, my name is Lorenzo Mark from right here on Myers Road. I know I'm here, and thank y'all for coming, that we don't have any data. Sound like to me we got a lot of data right here in the room. Of course, we're not mice, we're animals. But surely, it seems like to me, you all being here, let's start testing the individuals that are here. Surely they're not lying about their sickness and their number. So I thank you for going to France or Chevron, but the 500 doesn't match us. So maybe that number needs to come down to your high mark, which is 230. As of right now, we are not telling you are untruthful about our health condition. Citizen Health have been working on this very hard, and it's hurting to me to know that you're actually telling the people that there's nothing wrong. And no way that we are smelling and dealing with this and saying that there's nothing wrong. So I'm saying this, being the last responders for tonight, let's do the testing based upon the citizens that are here in 8 Mile.
We know it's wrong, that's why we're here.
And that's one question that, and the last one that we'll move forward to, that you all ask a question, that I have been asked on a number of occasions, is why in 4 years since 2008, it took this long after the spill happened in 2008 for us to get to this point and not have any answers. Steve. Anyone else there?
They're not breathing in. All right, Mayor, that's a fair question. Our first notice of complaint started somewhere about October of last year. So October of last year, people are calling us, people in the community are calling us at my office and saying, look, there's a natural gas leak out here. What can y'all do about it? Well, naturally, the first thing we're going to do is work with the gas company, ask the people, have you notified the gas company? You can imagine, of course, how long that can take. You know, as somebody from my organization receiving a phone call saying, well, it smells like there's a gas leak. So from October to January, as the calls continued to come in, that prompted us at my department to say, wait a minute, this is not indicative of a gas leak. The gas company says they can't find anything. Complaints are still coming in, and everybody here knows you're not going to just make this stuff up. If it smells bad, it smells bad, right? So that's when we really begin to really start tearing into the neighborhoods, trying to figure out what's going on. So from my perspective, I assigned one of my inspectors the task of riding this community in the evenings and early mornings and report back to me what his findings were. And I ended up at the Beaver Pond because my inspector came to me and he said, actually he was at the Beaver Pond, he called me on the phone, and he says, look, I'm here on Cochran Road, the smell is powerful, and I said, stop where you are, I'll be there. And we started investigating. That's what got me interested in the Beaver Pond in the first place. So, yes, it takes time. I know for the folks here who are dealing with this every day, it seems like it takes an eternity. Yes, it is a nuisance, I understand it. But it did take a lot of work just to get to this point of finding out what's going on. We know a whole lot more now than I did back in October.
Okay, this is the last one. And then we can come up and ask them after this.
I just want to ask, do you remember this complex from Japan and the water that is flowing over here? Do you really believe that you're going to be able to just clear up the water by putting an injection in there? The soil around, the soil that has been contaminated all the way down from the really wait a minute, one other thing. I'm sorry. I've been going to church on Bathard Road for years. And that smell has been here, like the mayor said, ever since 2008, the smell in the church. And all our members, headaches, throwing up, burning throats, breathing problems. And now everybody acting like it's nothing. I know you're here, we thankful that you're here, but you're acting as if it's nothing. You don't have any answers, and we study dying hard.
Okay, the first part of your question. Am I confident, are we confident that we can rid the groundwater of the mercaptan? The answer is yes. It's a matter of time. I can't tell you when. Okay? But we know that the source was a one-time event, or we're very, very certain the source was a one-time event. That's been stopped. So there is no more new mercaptan that's being injected into the ground. What we're dealing with is how long it takes for what's in the ground to ultimately come out at the pond. So yes, the treatment methods should work. How long it will take to begin to reduce the amount of mercaptan in the community, I don't know. We're working toward fixing it. That was the first part of your question. I forgot to say. But your question was, I smelled mercaptan since 2000, right? You were smelling for years.
Church.
Yes. Is it possible, keeping in mind that there's a gas line facility here, this is a facility where mercaptan is injected into the gas line, right? Is it possible that just the operation of the facility results in some background levels of mercaptan? Okay. Now, I don't know the answer to your question in terms of why would you smell it all the way back to 2008. I don't know.
Well, Dr. Carrasco, that was a question about what doctor can you go to get your health screen in reference to this. If you would, afterward, he would like to talk to anyone to give you some information on where you can go to get that screening done that does that kind of screening. But let me thank the High Point Baptist Church family and Reverend York and all of you for coming out, and especially Councilman Towner in reference to making this place available for us. But they will like to have sidebar conversation with you all if you would. So thank you all for coming.
Just close the meeting.